All right. We'll get started. I'm going to start with the Torah portion for this week. It's one of the fullest of Torah portions because it has a number of different things that take place in it. Kitisa takes its name from literally when you lift up. What it really means is when you count. When you count the children of Israel, they're not supposed to count them individually, but they're supposed to give a half shekel per head. In this way, you can count the shekels and not count the people. There's a very clear Jewish tradition to avoid counting people. And indeed, there's a tradition that if you want to count and see if 10 for a minyan, instead of counting 1, 2, 3, you recite a verse, which is a verse that has exactly 10 words in it. And so if you got a person for each word, then you've got a minyan. And there's further emphasized in the story when King David does a census and he is punished for it. So there's this tradition about not counting people. So in Kitisa, we begin by telling people how they will be counted. And everybody gives exactly a half shekel. No one gives more, no one gives less. And that was used for the communal sacrifices. Since everybody contributed equally, they were equally part of the Jewish people's observance of their responsibilities to God. And then it turns to a few more issues dealing with the tabernacle. And then again, a reference to the Shabbat. And then we come to really the major part of Kitisa, the story of the Egel HaZahav, the golden calf. Israel has just gone through this experience of receiving the Torah at Sinai according to the Torah. And all of a sudden they're afraid. And this is going to be repeating itself constantly throughout the story of the tribes as they leave Egypt and they make their way eventually after 40 years to Eretz Canaan, that they often lose faith. They get scared. There's a world of commentary written on this passage trying to explain it. How could they've just experienced all this wonderful things at Mount Sinai and then the next minute they're building a calf to worship? And so one explanation is they were not worshiping the calf, but they saw that as a symbol of God. Others that they misunderstood what Moses said when he was supposed to be coming down. So they thought he was supposed to be back earlier than he was. As I said, there are all kinds of things that are discussed about the meaning of this passage. Moses comes down from the mountain, sees the people worshiping the calf, throws down the luchot, the tablets of the covenant that are broken. He comes to the camp and gets rid of the idol, and there is a general havoc as a result of that. Moses goes back up on the mountain, pleads with God to forgive the Jewish people. He relents, but reluctantly, it seems. And indeed, we have a passage. The Lord says to Moses, say to the Israelite people, you are a stiff-necked people. The idea that they are stubborn, whether it be for good or for bad, the Jewish people are known to be very stubborn. And that seems to be a traditional understanding of what Jews are like. We're a very stubborn people. Whether it's for God or against God, we go in both directions. So Moses pleads with God to forgive Israel and asks to, in a very important passage, he says, the Lord said to Moses, I will also do this thing that you have asked, for you have truly gained my favor, and I've singled you out by name. That is not to destroy the people, and that God should lead them. But then Moses asked, he said, oh, let me behold your presence. Moses asked to be able to see the essence, the presence of God. And God responds in the Torah, I make all my goodness pass before you. I will proclaim before you the name of the Lord and the grace that I grant, the compassion that I show. But he said, you cannot see my face, for man may not see me and live. Now, this is not unique to the Jewish perspective. In the ancient world, the idea that to look at a god, pagan gods as well, was very dangerous. And if you may remember that Moshe at the burning bush, the story of the bush, he too is afraid to look at God. Later on, we read about Isaiah and Jeremiah when they confront God. There's clear indications they're afraid of what can aspire from that. So God says to Moses that he will place him in a cleft in the rock, causes his glory, whatever that means, which is obviously not spelled out, to pass before him. And as that occurs, there is a recitation of a passage, Adonai, Adonai, Rachum v'chanun nerech hapayim Rav Chesed, Rav Chesed v'yamet noser chesed l'alafim nosei avon v'feshe v'chata'a v'nakeh lo yinakeh pakod avon avot abanim v'albanei banim ashilishim v'al ribeim. So it says in English, the Lord, a God compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in kindness and faithfulness, extending kindness to the 1,000th generation, forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin. Yet he does not remit all punishment, but visits the iniquity of parents upon children and children's children upon the 3rd and 4th generation. So here it implies that God is merciful. This is known as the 13 attributes of God in this passage. But you can't escape responsibility for your actions. Interestingly enough, in Jewish liturgy, we repeat this passage, repeated numerous times on Yom Kippur and other times during the course of the year. But the rabbis cut it short. We end it when it says, the Lord, a God, compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in kindness and faithfulness, extending kindness to the 1,000th generation, forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin. All right? V'nakeh. And then it says, and he will hold clean or remit. It truncates it because it's actually in the Hebrews, nakeh lo yinakeh. He will certainly not remit all sin. But what the rabbis did was to cut off the second part of that phrase, lo yinakeh, making it emphasizing God's forgiveness. And so it's a fascinating use of a liturgical razor to cut out a passage a little bit. Normally we have a tradition that we say that we're not supposed to quote part of a verse. We're only supposed to quote an entire verse. But the rabbis themselves, in creating the liturgy that we use, chose to cut out that part. Later on in the book of Ezekiel, it makes very clear that God does not punish the children for the sins of their fathers. Each individual is responsible for their own sin. The rabbis deal with this in great depth and discussion in the Talmud and other places, expressing the idea, if you don't follow in the evil footsteps of your ancestors, then God forgives you. But if you choose to follow in those footsteps, to go in the wrong direction, then you have to bear even a heavier price for your misbehavior. Right? And certainly we understand that a person is very hard to escape the reality of their home, their family. And then following this, we're told about the festivals. There's a reference to the Jewish holidays and Pesach, especially, and the firstborn. Okay, so that is this week's Torah portion, Kitisa, which is really quite a packed passage in the Torah. I'm not going to do Hebrew per se tonight. But I'm going to immediately go into the discussion of the Haggadah. Now, I sent out to you some stuff that I've put together over many years. And I will probably never make it into a real Haggadah, but it's my cheat sheet for my Seders. And so I'm going to put that on the screen. And we're going to go through it. We're going through the order of the Seder so that we understand what is supposed to transpire at your Seder. I want to point out, I don't remember if I did it last week or not, this year is one of the unusual circumstances in which Passover begins on Saturday night. Normally, as I explained last week, the night before Passover, we search out the house, get rid of the chametz. The next morning, we're supposed to burn it. Well, we can't do that on the day before Passover because it's Shabbat. Can't go searching through the house with a lit candle. We can't burn the chametz in the morning. So the tradition is that the search for the chametz is done on Thursday night. Some still burn the chametz on Friday morning, but you do it without any blessing. And you need to leave behind enough bread to make hamotzi for the Friday night dinner. And you're supposed to have three meals on Shabbat: the evening, morning, lunchtime, afternoon, Sudah Shlishit. Well, we can't have really the Sudah Shlishit when it's Erev Pesach, just before Passover. Plus, we have an issue of we're not supposed to eat chametz after approximately 12:30, according to the sun, in the afternoon. Actually, an hour before that. So there is a tradition to daven very early, to have a very early lunch before the time of getting rid of the chametz. And then whatever is left, if there's any crumbs left from your challah, which is a good reason to have very small challahs on that time, you just have to flush them down the toilet or let your dog eat it or what have you. Unless, of course, your dog's a very frum dog, a very observant dog, in which case they may not want to eat chametz at that time, but that's their problem. All right?
A quick question for you, Rabbi.
Sure, of course.
Earlier, I don't know, a few months ago, you said whatever like holiday or Yom Tov occurs more often takes precedence.
Yes.
So like Shabbat would take precedence over Yom Kippur, and that. Why does it not occur with Passover?
Well, it does take precedence in this. Well, first of all, Passover and Shabbat aren't falling on the same day.
No, but like would be a Friday in the following week, or a Friday.
What happens is what will happen is the Friday of Pesach is observed. It's a Shabbat. You observe it as Shabbat. But instead of having challah, because we can't have chametz, you use matzah, just like we do at the Seder table. Is that the problem?
No, I understand. Like that's what you do, but just you had said whatever occurs more often takes precedence.
Yeah.
So Shabbat should take precedence over everything. Why doesn't it take precedence?
It does. So, for example, if you look in the prayer book, when we recite the prayers on Shabbat of a Yom Tov, let's take the candle lighting. All right, this year it's not going to take place, but it normally will take place on the end of Pesach. You light the candles on a normal Yom Tov. You simply say, Asher Kiddushanu Mitzvotav, who is sanctified by his commandments, Vitzivanu commanded us, Lahadlik Ner Shel Yom Tov, to kindle the light of Yom Tov. If it's Shabbat and Yom Tov, is Lahadlik Ner Shel Shabbat Yom Tov. Shabbat gets mentioned first, then Yom Tov. And in the Amidah, when we recite the Musaf Amidah when it falls on Shabbat, once again the mention is made of Shabbat first, and then mention is made of the holiday second. So in every case that is really of any significance, Shabbat will take precedence. Where it doesn't take precedence, interestingly enough, because it's not really because of Shabbat, the Torah reading. If Shabbat is a Yom Tov, then the Torah reading is for the Yom Tov Torah reading. Okay, but virtually everything else that you can think of, Shabbat takes precedence. It's just that we have to be cognizant of the holiday as well. Does that help? Well, since you're not responding, so I'll say.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
Okay, fine. All right. Also, all right. So, what takes place also, what is different, is that the mechirat chametz, the selling of the chametz, will take place on Friday, because you can't sell it on Shabbat. And just to show you from the Bayit, the Rabbi Korobkin sends out his version of the chametz form. Here it is. So this is what he sends out this year for selling of your chametz. You see how it's written. I'll read through it. Be it known that I, the undersigned, fully empower and permit, in this case, Rabbi Daniel Korobkin, to act in my place and on my behalf to sell all chametz possessed by me, knowingly and unknowingly, as defined by Torah law and its rabbinic explanations and protections. This includes chametz, possible chametz, mixtures containing chametz, and chametz that adheres to or is absorbed in the surface of all cooking utensils and implements. Rabbi Korobkin also has the right to lease out all locations in which chametz is stored and to lease out right of access to those locations. This sale includes chametz, and then he asks for a specific address. If vacant, keys to these locations will be available from March 26th until April 4th at the following address. The estimated value of the chametz I plan to sell is whatever that may be. Rabbi Daniel Korobkin has the right to sell and lease by transactions as he deems fit and proper for such time which he believes necessary, in accordance with all detailed terms and detailed forms as explained in the general authorization contract to be used this year by Rabbi Korobkin to sell the chametz. This power of attorney authorization is made a part of said contract. Also, I do hereby give Rabbi Korobkin full power of attorney to appoint a substitute in his stead, with full power to sell and lease as provided herein, and above given power is in conformity with all Torah law and its rabbinic explanations, protections, and also in accordance with the laws of the province of Ontario and of Canada. I understand the delegation of power of attorney takes effect by symbolic acquisition of physical item, or by verbal expression of agreement, or by hand clasping, or in other words, shaking hands, or by signing the contract below. I understand that the sale of chametz and leasing a storage space and access for which Rabbi Korobkin will be the agent will be effective beginning at or before the morning of Friday, March 26th. I understand that the sale of chametz and leasing of storage space and access for which Rabbi Korobkin will be the agent will be complete and unconditional. The purchaser will have every right to enter the addresses listed and to make every use of the chametz stored therein, as that chametz will belong to the purchaser. And to this, I hereby fix my signature, and all the dates, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a very legal sounding document, I think. All right. So dots all the I's and crosses all the T's, even though, as I explained last week, we all know that what is ultimately going to happen is that the person who purchases it will most likely back out the night after Passover is over. But if he doesn't, then duty bound to indeed live by this contract.
Sorry, Rabbi.
Yes.
So traditionally, Jews sell chametz before Passover and all their utensils. Do people in Thornhill do this? Like actually sell their utensils and all their chametz? Will you be selling your chametz?
Yes. When I was rabbi of a synagogue, I had my own version of this form that I had people from my synagogue fill out.
And it's to fulfill the tradition that Jews used to sell their chametz to non-Jews before Passover?
Yeah. It's not that Jews used to, I can't tell you for sure when the practice began. It most likely there's no mention of it, excuse me, in the Talmud. There is mention of the issue of chametz that belongs to somebody else, if it's in your property, and the rules and regulations thereof. But probably, back in biblical times, and certainly in the rabbinic period, or up to, I'm not sure, like I said, when this began, it was relatively easy to dispose of all the chametz. But when we began to get closer to the modern era, this custom arose because of the issue of amounts of materials that people might have that made it very difficult to really eliminate them altogether from their life. So what are you going to do? I always joke about it, but it's true. I have a number of bottles of bourbon. I'm not a Scotch man, I'm a bourbon man. I might have fun drinking all those bottles before Pesach, but if I had to get rid of them, that's quite a substantial loss of money. I just have to enjoy it very much. But let's say you're in business and you own a bakery, okay? And you buy your wheat, your flour, in huge amounts of flour. You're a commercial baker, or you're a commercial distiller. My understanding is that the, what's the name of the company? The big Canadian liquor company? Seagram's. Seagram's was owned by a Jewish family. At least back when they used to sell all of Seagram's to a Gentile for Pesach. All right. Mark, I hope that's not some of my bourbon that you were drinking.
No, it's just iced tea.
I know, I saw. I couldn't help it though. I got to chuck a little. So anyway, so it is still maintained. Those who follow Jewish tradition still do this, still follow through it. Like I tried to explain last, you weren't here, I think. Were you? But be that as may, it's in order to not violate the biblical commandment to own chametz on Passover. The rabbis put a knas, a fine, that any chametz that was owned by a Jew on Passover cannot be used by a Jew after Passover. And you will see that there are stores that are Jewish owned that make clear that they sell their chametz before Passover. If they don't, there's some communities where the rabbi will say you can't go to X, Y, or Z for a certain period of time until they use up any items that they may have had in their stocked on their shelves in their possession over Passover. Okay. There's even there's some literature talking, again, my favorite subject of alcoholic beverages, about certain bourbons that are owned by a Jewish family and as a closed corporation, as to whether or not that would be considered to be a problem for Passover if they don't sell their chametz, which apparently they don't. So yeah, for those who follow Jewish tradition, this is a very important element of the observance of Passover. All right? Like I said, when I had a conservative synagogue in Thornhill, when I was the rabbi of the synagogue, we had the same thing. I had people either signing a document and sent into by the mail, or they came by to me and personally gave me the right to sell their chametz. And then I indeed would do exactly what I've described. Okay.
Rabbi,
Yes.
what should be done with like plain flour, is it considered hametz or?
It's regarded as chametz because it does have the possibility of water having come in contact with it to some degree.
Oh.
You're not obligated, since you're not Jewish yet, you're not obligated in the mechirat chametz to sell it. Okay. But what happens is that everything that is either real chametz or has an admixture of chametz in it are removed from the shelves in the home, and they're placed away in a corner or in cabinets that are locked up that we do not touch during the course of Passover. And don't touch them until after Passover and after a period of time, in which case the chametz may have been purchased back by the rabbi, or the deal has fallen through.
I see.
Similarly, we rent our utensils that it's stored in, all of that, as well as the place in the homes where it is stored. That was in that document. The document says that the rabbi has the right on my behalf to lease those places where the chametz is stored. And if they want to come into my home during Passover, I have to tell them where a key will be located so they can come into the house. And since I live in the house,
Yes,
they
sir.
can knock on the door and come in. And when I was selling the chametz, as the rabbi selling it, I would give to the non-Jew a key to my house so that they could come in if they wanted to and pick up their chametz. So while it can be called a legal fiction, we do everything we can to make it as legally binding and truthful as possible. Okay.
Okay.
Is that clear to everyone? It's not an old, not in conservative synagogues, certainly the rabbis, the synagogues, many members of the synagogue followed this tradition very carefully.
Thanks for explaining.
You're quite welcome. That's my job. Okay. As I said, I sent out the version of a Haggadah that I've been working on for years, just so we have something to look at. You don't have to use this in any way, shape, or form. Matter of fact, the number of Haggadot that are out in the world is amazing. Every year there's somebody coming up with a new Haggadah. It used to be my practice that every year I would buy a new Haggadah to have available to me. I've stopped doing that, but because I'm running out of bookshelf space for it. But I've got about three good-sized bookshelves of Haggadot, individual Haggadot. Some have wonderful English in them. Some have all Hebrew and commentaries in Hebrew across the ages. So that is what one should do. One should really find a Haggadah that really works for them very much. All right. So let's see. I'm going to reduce it a little bit because I got you guys in the corner. Whoops. No. Let's try this way. Okay. So this is my Haggadah of Pesach. So I said the night before, in this case this year on Thursday night, we have the searching for the chametz, the bedikat chametz. Before we do it, we recite the bracha. As always, it begins with the formula of blessing of mitzvah, asher kiddushanu mitzvotav, v'tzivanu, al biur chametz. It's actually for the removal of the chametz or destruction of the chametz. All right. So then we go through the house and we search it all out. And then once we have finished the search, we have to recite what is called a bitul, a nullification of chametz. Which here it says any chametz that is in my possession which I did not see, remove, or know about, shall be nullified and become ownerless like the dust of the earth. Now, in a normal year, the next day, we would then burn it, arrange for it to be burned, and then what we say, and that, again, the formula has changed a little bit, which is any chametz that is in my possession, which I did not see, which I did or did not see, which I did or did not remove, shall be nullified and become ownerless like the dust of the earth. Now, when we have Shabbat, a Yom Tov leading into Shabbat, there's a tradition of having a special Eruv allowing us to cook on Yom Tov for Shabbat. We'll skip over that. We'll talk about another time. So this is the basic structure of the evening. Okay, you have 2 cups of wine that are drunk before the meal, and there are going to be 2 cups of wine that will be drunk after the meal. So we have 1 cup for the kiddush, and 1 cup which we pour for recitation of the Hallel. After the meal, we have a 3rd cup for the Hallel and a 4th cup to conclude it. All right, the 3rd cup is actually the Birkat Hamazon, and the 4th cup is for Hallel. We then turn to the introduction. We tell people that they're welcome to come in, the Halach Ma'anya, which is actually in Aramaic, and the Seder concludes with next year in Jerusalem. And then some parts of it are in Aramaic, some parts are in Hebrew. There's a tradition of reciting a formula. This is one that has become the tradition, which is the listing of everything that's going to take place during the course of the night. Traditionally, in many homes, they will sing it. They'll go, Kadesh Urchatz Karpas Yachatz Magid Rochza Motzi Matzah Maror Korech Shulchan Orech Safun Barech Halel Nirza. So those are the 14 steps that take place during the course of the evening. Kiddush, the first washing hands, the greens, the dividing of the matzah, the telling the story, the washing before the meal, the blessing over the matzah, the bitter herbs, the Hillel sandwich, dinner, the conclusion of the dinner ceremony, Birkat Hamazon, Hallel, and then recitation of the acceptance of what has transpired. Okay, so again, when we were at, I was asked about earlier, if Pesach falls on Friday night, we begin the Kiddush with a normal introduction to the Friday night Kiddush, which is this: Vayerev Vayevoka, there's an evening and morning on the 6th day, the heavens and earth and all the hosts were completed, etc., etc. Then we turn to the Kiddush itself. The Kiddush this year, because it's not Shabbat, we recite it without the parenthetical passages for Shabbat. But what we do, we'll see in a minute, we have a special edition because it's Saturday night, we have to say Havdalah. So we take the first cup of wine, we say Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam borei pri hagafen. Then the Kiddush itself, which the way we sing it on Yom Tov is a little different from the way we sang it on Shabbat. We would say Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam borei pri hagafen. Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam Asher bachar banu mikol ha'am v'romanu kol hasham v'kedishanu b'mitzvotav v'atiten lanu Hashem Elokeinu b'yava moadim l'simcha chagim uzmanim l'sasahon et yom chag hamatzot hazeh Zaman Chayrotenu, Mikra Kodesh, Zecher Litziat Mitzrayim, Kivanu V'charta, V'yatan Gidash Mikol Amim, Moadei Kodeshecha, B'simcha V'sason, Hinchaltanu, Baruch Atah Hashem, Gadesh Yisrael, V'hazmanim. So as we see here in the English, the blessing of a God, the King of the universe, has chosen, exalted us above all nations, sanctified us with your commandments, and you, Lord our God, have loving bestowed upon us Sabbaths for rest. Well, not Sabbaths, appointed times for happiness, holidays and seasons for joy, this feast of Matzah, our season of freedom, a holy convocation recalling the exodus from Egypt. You did choose and sanctify us above all peoples. In your gracious love, you did grant us your holy appointed times for happiness and joy. Wellspring of blessing you, O Lord, who sanctifies Israel in the appointed times. Now, when Passover begins or coincides with Saturday night, we have to say Havdalah. Normally on a Saturday night, we have a special candle that we light with more than one wick, have spices and a cup of wine. We do not use the spices, and we can't light the candle. So usually we just use the candles that are lit for Yom Tov. And then we have the blessing, the Havdalah blessing. That's what follows here. And that's what we're going to be doing this year. All right, which basically talks about God who creates the light of fire and who distinguishes between the sacred and the secular. And then both nights, whether or not there is the Havdalah, we say the Shehechianu. We always say Shehechianu the first two nights of the holidays, thanking God who has enabled us to reach this season, this milestone of the year. Okay, so that's Kadesh, the first of the 14 steps of the Seder, of the Haggadah. So now we come to number 2, Urchatz, washing of hands. Before we have the karpas, the green vegetable, we wash our hands. And there's discussions, as I point out here, about why we don't say a blessing when we wash our hands at this time. And according to the Shulchan Aruch, it was required only in times of the temple. And it's retained, one, because it's odd and thus arouses the child's curiosity, which is one of the goals of many acts at the Seder table. And the festive formality of the Seder recalls the temple service, so the leader, like the priest of old, prepares himself by washing. Now, the language there of the Shulchan Aruch points out that there are different customs. Some have the practice of only the leader of the Seder washing his or her hands. Others have the practice of everybody washing their hands. And we do it just like we would do if we were going to eat bread. We twice on one hand, twice on the other, then dry our hands. But in this case, we do not say the blessing. And then we take a piece of a vegetable. The word in Hebrew is karpas, which is usually translated as celery. And we dip it in salt water. And before we eat it, we say the blessing, Barei Priya Adama, who creates the fruit of the earth. Now, the reason usually given as an explanation of this practice is that we want to be reminded of the tears that our ancestors shed in Egypt during the time of slavery. And indeed, we're supposed to see ourselves this night as if we ourselves personally went out from bondage, out of slavery. And so that is the traditional answer that you will hear. And if you went to a Hebrew school, they usually give that answer to explain this whole practice. Now, we also know, though, probably the historical reason relates to the fact that the Seder meal, the Seder itself, is a meal in which we're supposed to celebrate our freedom. And the practice of wealthy Jews becomes the paradigm for what takes place at the Seder. And it was the practice in wealthy homes, and indeed we know that this was also a general practice in Greek tradition, to start your evening off before you eat dinner by having some kind of hors d'oeuvres, some kind of salad, vegetables of some kind to whet the appetite, to prepare yourself for the meal. And that's where it really comes from originally. So it's an act of showing us this is like it's a special meal tonight. It's a special celebration. Tonight, we are like the wealthy. And that's why we recline, because the wealthy people reclined in those days at the Seder. Now, and whenever we eat or drink wine or eat one of the symbolic freedom foods, we are supposed to recline to the left, as I said last week. So too, after we dip this a vegetable into salt water, we recline. Now, it doesn't have to be parsley or which is some people do. Some people, as I said, use celery. I'm not a big fan of either one, so I have green onions. My wife always makes sure I have some green onions for me to dip. That's my celebration. We dip it today only in salt water, but there are also some indications that they used to do it in vinegar as well. And indeed, that probably was the original practice. And I would say to people, today we have salad, we put the dressing on the salad. In their days, they dipped the salad into the dressing. And this dipping is one of the dippings that are mentioned that we'll come to when we come to the 4 questions. Okay. And as we'll see when we get there, the Mishnah, the 4 questions have changed over the ages as a result of certain historical realia. So that originally in the 4 questions, we say on other nights we dip once, this night we dip twice. Why this night do we dip twice? But in the Haggadah that we have today, we say on all other nights we don't dip even once. But tonight, we dip twice. Then comes another interesting stage of the evening, and that's the breaking of the middle matzah, yachatz. We take on the Seder table, as a general tradition is today, we have 3 matzot. And we take the middle of, and they have to be whole matzot, 3 whole matzahs. And we take the middle one and we break it apart. Ideally, a little bit more than half and a little less than half. And the larger portion is taken away and it will be hidden as the afikomen. And what that has come to mean in today's world is the afikomen is the piece of matzah that we eat at the very end of the meal. The rabbi said that we're supposed to eat the Passover sacrifice when we are satiated. We shouldn't eat it at a time of when we're very, very hungry, ravenously hungry, because we're supposed to be doing it for the purpose of the mitzvah. So the afikomen, since it's taking the place of that Passover sacrifice, that is eaten at the end of the meal when we're already pretty full from the evening. There's some commentaries here if anybody wants to look at it on their own about the matzah. A nice custom that is found in some Haggadot, and I've used it when I had my grandchildren around, is to have them put the afikomen into a backpack or something and march around the table as if they're on their way going out of Egypt. And because the matzah serves 2 purposes. The matzah at the beginning of the meal is a matzah that indicates it's supposed to be like the bread of affliction, the bread we ate when in Egypt, the bread of servitude, of bondage. At the end of the meal, it becomes the bread of freedom. Now it is the bread of bondage. And so afterwards, after we break the matzah, middle matzah, we raise that, some raise all, or just the one matzah, and we make a declaration, halach ma'anya, which is in Aramaic. In English, this is the bread of affliction, which our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt. Let all who are hungry come and eat. Let all who are needy come and celebrate the Passover. At present, we are here. Next year, may we be in Israel. At present, we are slaves. Next year, may we be free men. And there's a lot of discussion why this is in Aramaic, not Hebrew. And the simplest, straightforward explanation is that it's supposed to be a real invitation. You're supposed to be really inviting people to join you at your Seder table. Well, if you're inviting people at your Seder table, you have to invite them in a language they understand. After all, if you're going to invite them in a language they don't understand, what kind of invitation is that? And since when this was first composed, it was at a time when most Jews spoke Aramaic, it was written in Aramaic. There are other explanations. You can take a look if you want. All right, then comes the famous 4 questions, Aman Nishtana. We've taken either fill the cup if we drank all of it, the wine, or at least we fill it to the top now, and we recite the Arba Kashot, the 4 questions. The tradition is the youngest member of the household at the Seder who can do it is supposed to recite the 4 questions. It's always fun to have the kids doing that. This is the way it appears today. And as I said, it has undergone some changes. We have a problem. Manishtana halayla zemikol halaylot is either why is this night different from all other nights, or how this night is different from all other nights. And then the 4 questions are, on all other nights we eat chametz and matzah. Tonight, only matzah. Okay. On all other nights we eat any kind of herbs. Tonight, we eat bitter herbs. On other nights, we do not dip even once. Tonight, why do we dip the greens twice? On all other nights, we eat sitting or reclining. Tonight, why do we all recline? So these are all strange things that are unusual that take place at the Seder. And so the 4 questions was created as a means of having the children have something to ask. We're told in the Talmud, there's whole discussions about this as to whether or not it absolutely is necessary. And we have stories about other questions that were asked. They said, so you don't need to do the 4 questions anymore. Originally, the question about reclining was not in the Haggadah because that was not unusual. That was known to people. But what was the 4th question? The 4th question was, on other nights we eat meat, whether it's stewed or it's roasted. Tonight we eat only roasted meat because a Passover sacrifice had to be roasted. So in the times of the temple, when they had a Passover sacrifice, they ate it roasted. Tonight, when in temple times, that was the only thing you could eat roasted. However, today we don't have that, and so the question about the reclining was added in as a substitute. So now we begin the story of the night. And the famous argument as to how we're supposed to fulfill the basic mitzvah. The basic mitzvah is that we begin in Shem, Ganai, and we end in Shevach, in praise. So this is the version according to Rav as to what we are going to say, what was our shame. Our shame was that we were slaves to Pharaoh. Avadim ayinu leFaro. And God took us out of there with a mighty hand and outstretched arm. And had God not done this, we and our children and grandchildren would still be enslaved to Pharaoh in Egypt. And even if we are wise and perceptive, experienced and versed in Torah, it would be our duty to tell about the Exodus from Egypt. The more one talks about the Exodus, the more praise he deserves. So this has two elements to it. One, it has the element of telling us what the beginning of the story is all about, that we were slaves. And two, that we're supposed to spend a lot of time talking about Yetziat Mitzrayim, the going out of Egypt. And that's a very important element of the Passover Seder, to talk and understand the history and the whys and wherefores thereof. We note that the Haggadah, of course, was originally composed mostly in Hebrew with some Aramaic. And many people say the Seder today in Hebrew and with the Aramaic passages. Some try to say some of it in English. Some say it all in English. All of these are possible ways of doing it. Ideally, you should understand what's going on. So even one of the medieval rabbinic sources, the Balei Tosafot, one of the Tosafot who lived in England at that time, said that they would translate the Haggadah for the women and children who didn't understand the Hebrew. Which tells you, one, that women were not educated in Hebrew in those days, and two, that he was being kind, because there are a lot of men who didn't understand Hebrew as well. So now, since we have said we're supposed to spend a lot of time talking about it, there's a story that we tell that follows this, the story of the rabbis spent the whole night talking about the Exodus from Egypt. And that's a sign. If they, who knew the story clearly, spent the whole night talking about the Exodus from Egypt, all the more so we should direct ourselves to telling the story in depth and going over it. We then have thrown into this kind of in the middle of it, the story about Rabbi Elazar Nazari, who says, I'm like a 70-year-old man, I'm not succeeded in convincing that the Exodus from Egypt should be mentioned at night. Without going into all the great details of it, it has to do with an argument about what has to be recited part of the evening prayer. And according to this passage that Ben Zoma said, it means the world and not only here and now, but even in the world to come, days of the Messiah. And again, there's some comments there about the Rabbi Eliezer. We'll skip over that. We then begin the praising part a little bit. Baruch HaMakom, Baruch Hu, Baruch Shenatan Torah L'Amo Yisrael, Baruch Hu, blessed be the omnipresent, blessed be he. Okay, I see that is in the wrong place. All right, we'll figure that out later. All right. So the word makom, place, is also understood to be another name of God. And here, interestingly enough, if you look at the gematria, the numerical value of the letters, that parallels the numerical value of the Yud Hey Vav Hey, the name of God. So now comes the story of the four sons or the four children, one wicked, wise, one wicked, one simple, one who doesn't know how to ask a question. In a short explanation of this, we're supposed to read about this. First of all, the Torah itself starts off with these quotes. There are passages that are mentioned in the Torah that this little section is built upon. And the rabbis interpret them to referring to four different kinds of children. And they played a few games with it in order to create this little story-like thing. With the wise son saying, what is the meaning of the testimonies, the statutes and laws which the Lord our God has commanded you? And then with the answer, he says, explain to the laws of Passover that no dessert may be eaten after the Passover sacrifice. So the wise son, according to many interpretations, asks about the basic meaning of the evening. The wicked son asks, what does the service mean to you? By the words to you implies that the service is only for you and not for himself. Right? The rabbis are always very careful in language. If you say, what does this mean to you? He should have said, what does this mean to us? Then it would be a legitimate question. But to you, he's excluding himself. He's not part of the community for the Seder. And as I said, they answer him very harshly. And every year when my oldest son is with us for the Seder, almost always we get into a whole discussion, debate over the full meaning of this passage and how to understand it. I want to point out that interestingly, the wise son actually says the same thing. He says, commanded you. And a lot of ink is spilled over, well, how is he different from the wicked son? If it's you versus you. And the fact of the matter is, the original version of this was most likely, as we find in the Talmud of the land of Israel and in the Mechilta, that the wise son says us, not you, but that misquotes the verse. And somebody comes along later on and says, he's not quoting the verse accurately. So changes it to fit the verse, but by changing it to fit the verse, he kind of messes up the basic premise of the difference between the wise son and the wicked son. A simple child says, what is it all about? And then finally, there's a child who doesn't know enough how to ask, and you begin explaining to him or her. And many understand this. I mean, there are different kinds of people. There are going to be different kinds of people at a Seder. And each one of them has to be addressed in terms of their level, their ability, their knowledge of what's going on at the Passover Seder. Right? So we then began talking about, maybe we could have started earlier. I'm going to skip over this and now come to, this is the Shmuel's version of what the shame was. Remember I said we begin with Rav's version. Rav, one of the great sages of the Talmudic era, says the shame was that we were slaves. Shmuel says, no, it goes back further, that our ancestors worshipped idols. And when they lived on the other side of the Euphrates River, Terach, the father of Abraham and Nahor, worshipped other gods. And then God, as it says in the book of Joshua, I took your father Abraham from the other side of the river and led him to the land of Canaan. I increased his family, gave him Isaac. To Isaac I gave Jacob and Esau. To Esau I gave Mount Seir to inherit. However, Jacob and his children went down to Egypt. So we're beginning now to tell the story. We've been leading up to actual telling the story. We really haven't gotten to that point. So we praise God who always fulfills his promises based upon the understanding of God promised that we would go down to Egypt, but he also promised that he would take us back up again from Egypt. And so that's God fulfilling his promise. And as it says in that paragraph. So then we raise the cup of wine and we say this promise has sustained our ancestors and us, for not only one enemy has risen against us to annihilate us, but in every generation men rise against us, but the Holy One, blessed be he, saves us from their hand. So we not only are cognizant of what took place during the time of Israel in Egypt, we're also cognizant of the fact that throughout Jewish history, there have been periods in which we've had to rely on God to save us from those around us. All right, so now we come to the core of the telling of the story. Interestingly enough, they choose a passage that we today probably would not choose. And it starts off not with the Exodus story, but it's this passage which says, go and learn what Laban the Syrian tried to do to our father Jacob. Well, Pharaoh decreed only against newborn males. Laban tried to uproot all of Israel. As is written, the Aramean sought to destroy my father. However, he went down to Egypt and sojourned there, few in number, And there he became a great, mighty, and numerous nation. And now what's going to follow is a form of midrash. Each statement is then broken down to its parts to emphasize the meaning of what we're trying to say. So it says, he went down to Egypt compelled by divine decree. It wasn't that Jacob went to Egypt because he wanted to go there for a holiday. He was forced to go down there for a holiday. Famously, there is a Haggadah, always like an Israeli Haggadah that was written just not too long ago. And it shows a picture of the Jews leaving Egypt, going to the land of Israel, and meeting them in the middle of the Sinai Peninsula, or a family of Israelis on their way to Egypt to spend the holiday. Just a kind of a little joke on today's reality. Right? So they were forced to go to Egypt. Then we're saying how they went there to sojourn. Their intent was not to be there permanently, but for a short time. They went down few in number and became mighty. They became a great nation and filled the land. And he goes through all the different passages there. And then it turns out the Egyptians embittered us and made us work in hard labor. And we cried out to God, and he heard us. God heard our cry, and he saw our affliction. And he goes through the various passages there. And he brings us out of Egypt and brings us to eventually that night when he goes through the land and God destroys the Egyptian firstborn and the illusions that are found there. So after we go through these passages to explain the meaning of the Exodus from Egypt, we mentioned the fact that God took us out with the moftim, that's the blood. As it says, "V'natati moftim v'shamayim v'oretz," wonders alludes to the plague of blood, as is written, "I will show wonders in the sky and on the earth." And then we have these three statements: dam v'esh v'tinrot ashan, blood, fire, and columns of smoke. This represents the plagues. And the tradition is we have our full cup of wine, the second cup of wine, and we take 3 drops of wine out of the cup, a drop for each one of these things. Symbolic that our cup shouldn't be full when somebody else is suffering. And then another interpretation is that each one of these words is a reference to the plagues, so that you end up with each 2-word phrase represents 2 plagues. Strong hand makes 2, outstretched arm 2, great arm 2, miraculous signs 2, wonders 2. These are the 10 plagues which the Holy One, blessed be, brought upon the Egyptians in Egypt, namely. And then once again, as we recite each one of the 10 plagues, we're supposed to take some wine out of our cup. Dam, Sfardei, Akinim, Aro, Dever, Shchein, Barad, Arbe, Choshech, Makat, Bachorot, blood, frogs, vermin, wild animals, cattle disease, boils, hail, locusts, darkness, and death of the firstborn. And then it says, Rabbi Yehuda haynatein bahem simanim. Rabbi Yehuda gave signs, so we remember exactly what the order of these were. Desach hadash biachav. And we again pour out wine. What then follows is the rabbinic way of playing, kind of playing games. What the rabbis do is they multiply the meaning of the plagues in Egypt. The reason for that is because it says at the sea that when God says to Israel, if you obey my commandments, the plagues that I brought upon Egypt, I won't bring upon you. So if we just understood to be 10 plagues, well, that means God's sparing us 10 plagues. But if we can increase the number of the plagues, the meaning of the number of the plagues, we're protected from more and more things. And that's what this whole passage is all about, which we'll skip over that. Okay, now we come to one of the songs, passages in the Seder, known as the Dayenu. Many families sing it. Kamalot Tavot Makom Aleinu. God has built many favors upon us, and it says, Ilu Hotzi Yanu Mi Mitzrayim Lo Asavahem Shefatim Dayenu. Dayenu. You can go all night long with the refrain. But what it does is it goes through the various aspects of what took place. And each time we say that if God had only done that, that would have been sufficient. We would have been happy with that. It's not so clear that we've been so happy, but that's what the nature of the song implies. Let me get to fix some of these up while I'm talking to you. That's the poem version of it, and then we have it recited again in just a kind of a prose version of that. So now we come to what, according to the Mishnah, is the important elements that we must recite as part of the Seder after the Haggadah, after telling the story. And as Rabbi Gamliel says, anyone who's not discussed these three things on Passover has not fulfilled his duty, namely Pesach, the Passover offering, Matzah, the unleavened bread, and Maror, the bitter herbs. So these three elements are there. Now we don't have the Pesach, the Passover sacrifice, but we do traditionally on the Seder plate, we have a shank bone or a chicken bone of some kind that is to symbolize the Passover sacrifice. And we point to that. We don't point to it, traditionally we don't point to it, but we say, why did our ancestors eat the Passover during this time? And we explain that, what do I do here? That it was the word Pesach, which translates in English as Passover, means exactly that. It means to go over, to pass over. Pasach. God passed over the Egyptian homes, and we celebrate his protection of us through the sacrifice. We then take the matzah, and notice now, earlier we said this is the bread of affliction that our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt. But this was being recited at the time of the temple, and so it says, not the bread of affliction, it's because the King of Kings, the Holy One, revealed himself to our ancestors and redeemed them before their dough had time to ferment, to rise. As it is written, they baked the dough which they brought out of Egypt into unleavened cakes, for they were driven out of Egypt and could not delay, nor had they provided any provisions for their journey. So here you see that the matzah now represents freedom. We've begun the process of moving from slavery to moving to freedom, right? And so we lift up the hafikomen matzah for, not the matzah, the middle matzah for that, and we say it. We then take the maror, the bitter herb, and we again say, why do we eat the bitter herbs? Because they made life bitter with hard labor, clay, and bricks. And then we say to every generation, we have a responsibility to tell this story. And then we begin the Hallel. Therefore, we are obligated to give thanks and praise, to pay tribute, glory, glorify, exalt, and honor, praise, claim the Holy One performed all these miracles for our ancestors and for us. He took us out of slavery into freedom, out of grief into joy, out of mourning into a festival, out of darkness into a great light, out of slavery into redemption. We will recite a new song before him, hallelujah. So then we begin, this is the beginning of the Hallel service, the Hallel portion. We have Psalm 113, Psalm 114 that we recite at this time. Some raise a cup of wine for all of it, some just raise it at the end. When we say the blessing over the Hallel and we drink the second cup of wine, once again, we recline to the left as we drink the wine. So now we come to, we've gone Kadesh, Urchatz, Yachatz, Rachatz, Motzi. Now we're coming to Rochza, to the washing of the hands for the Hamotzi. This time, once again, we wash the hands, but this time we're going to recite the Hamotzi. And so we say a blessing over the washing of the hands. Asher Kiddushanu Mitzvotav V'tzivanu Al Netilat Yadayim, for the washing the hands. Then, as it says in the directions, we take the 3 matzot. Actually, there are 2 whole matzot and the broken one. So we lift all 3 together with the middle matzah in the broken one in the middle. And we cite the hamotzi, because the blessing is for all of them. We then drop the bottom matzah and still remain holding the top matzah and the broken matzah. And we recite the blessing for the eating of matzah, because this is now a fulfillment of the mitzvah of eating the matzah. And that's why we say, Asher Kiddushanu Mitzvotav V'tzivanu Al Achilat Matzah, sanctifies the commandments and commanded us concerning eating matzah. And so that, and then we take a bit from the top and from the middle matzah, so everybody has to eat from those 2 matzahs. We then have the bitter herbs. Whatever you're using for bitter herbs, there's whole different, there are discussions and different kinds of opinions on various issues there. Some use a horseradish, some use romaine lettuce. I use both together, so there's no question, because romaine lettuce that we have is not that bitter. So we take them and we dip it in the charoset. The charoset is a mixture of various elements, usually almond or walnuts or some other kinds of nuts that are kosher at Passover. Wine, various other elements, seasoning maybe, and they chopped up, and they are said to represent the mortar that was used on the bricks. And so we dip the bitter herbs in it and shake off the charoset. And the blessing we recite now is the blessing for eating the maror, eating the bitter herb. And since it's bitter, we don't recline, because it's reminding us of the bitterness, not the joy. And then we have what we call the Hillel sandwich. We take from the bottom matzah with some bitter herb and dip again in the charoset, and we recite. This is what Hillel used to do in the days of the temple. He would combine the matzah and the maror and the Passover sacrifice to eat them together. Then comes dinner. Now I should point out, between the first 2 cups of wine and between the 3rd and 4th cups of wine, you're not supposed to drink any other wine. If you want to drink wine during the meal, you're allowed to do so. Right? So we have the meal. Ideally, we should finish the meal before midnight so that we can eat the afikomen before midnight. Depending upon how late in the year this Seder is going to be, this year it's going to be relatively late after daylight savings time. So it's like 1:30 in the morning that is celestial midnight. We eat the dinner, have a nice meal. At the end of the meal, we pass around the afikomen. Everybody has a little piece of the afikomen. And then we have the 3rd cup of wine is poured. We have the birkat hamazon. We recite the grace after meals. I'm going to just zip through that. Okay. Then when we finish the birkat hamazon, once again we say the blessing Borei Pi Hagafen, and we recline to the left as we drink it. Now, traditionally, a 4th cup of wine is poured in honor of Elijah, the prophet. We also pour a 4th cup of wine for everybody else. The door is opened, and we recite the Shvo Chamad. This needs some explanation. Passover obviously falls in the time of year, which is Easter time. And Passover is not always the best of times for Yidden. We know that there was the blood libel that was often used against Jews at this time, claiming that Jews killed Christian children and used their blood to bake the matzahs. There were a couple of episodes that took place around Passover time. And so one explanation is first of all, we opened the door to make sure nobody's standing around out there or no dead bodies deposited by our doors. And then we have a passage that is rather expresses the bitter feelings that the Jews had over the ages against those who would attack us. Pour out your wrath upon the nations that do not recognize you, and wicked governments that do not invoke your name, for they have devoured Jacob and destroyed his habitation. Pour your anger upon them and let your burning wrath overcome them. With your wrath pursue them and wipe them out from under the heavens of the Lord. I know in some modern Haggadot, more liberal Haggadot, they prefer not to have this passage, and some may therefore omit it. We now turn to the recitation of the part of Hallel that we haven't yet recited. So these are all the passages of Hallel that we have yet to get to. And then when we finish with the Hallel, we have according to some, a long blessing that we recite that is really the passage that we do on Shabbat morning or Yom Tov morning before we come to Shochenad. All of that is part of it that we have here with the Yishtabach, and ending with how it's fitting to give thanks to God, for you are God eternal. Some say the blessing and some do not say the blessing at this point. Then we have the fourth cup of wine. We drink the fourth cup of wine. We say the blessing. We drink the fourth cup. Since we've drunk wine and we've had at least a kazayas worth of wine, in this case, excuse me, we've had enough of the wine to require a blessing afterwards. We recite the blessing after wine. And then we recite what is called nirtza, the acceptance. The Seder now includes, according to halacha, complete in all laws and ordinances. Just as we were privileged to arrange it tonight, so may we be granted to perform it again. O pure one who dwellest in the heights above, establishes a countless people once again. Speedily guide your plan, speedily guide your as you plan Israel as a redeemed people to the land of Zion with joy. And the next year in Jerusalem. And then now there are a number of hymns that were added into some Haggadot. I have them here. And then there are also songs that were sung at the Seder, Adir Huzva, Echamiyadea, Chagadia, one kid. All of these are part and parcel of the Passover Seder. So that's basically it. When you have a Seder, it's certainly a time to talk about the meaning of freedom. What does it mean to be free? What does it mean in today's world? How are we to understand what the Seder can mean in our own day and age? Ideally, you do the entire Haggadah. Not everybody does understand that. But certainly there are certain basic elements that I pointed out. You have to say at least the basic storytelling. You got at least the references to the matzah and the maror and the Passover sacrifice, the Hallel and Birkat. But you can use it to understand what is it. What do they all mean? That's some of the comments I have in there. If you want to look at it on your own, you'll see some of them are meant to explain how some view them. There are all kinds of possible questions that one can ask. What is it? Why do we have to talk about a wise son, a wicked son, a simple son? One does not. What kind of people do these represent in our own world? Why do we have the Passover sacrifice? Today we don't have it, but why do we think of it? Why do we connect to the Passover sacrifice? What does it mean to see ourselves as if we were slaves in Egypt? What purpose does it serve? That historical memory. All of these are kinds of things that people can talk about. The Haggadah that we recommended for a lot of people, the family Haggadah, is a great Haggadah, especially for those who aren't really conversant with everything. It has all kinds of wonderful extras to help guide you in what you can do this Seder. And so, use it as a time, not just to run through it, rush through whatever you're going to do and have a nice big meal and then rush through what comes afterwards. Although we generally end up doing pretty quickly the second half. We sing it all or say it all out loud together in kind of a rush. What we do in my Seders is that everybody takes a turn reciting a passage, either in Hebrew or in English, depending on what they feel comfortable with. And we go around the table, everybody getting a chance to involve themselves that way. So it can be a wonderful experience to do. We will have our exam next week. That means I have to write one up now this week. We didn't do the section on the history, so we're going to reserve that for later on. I will probably, as I said, I will record, I think, the lesson so that you can do it at your own time later on. But what we will do is I will send out the exam next week. You will be able to take it before Wednesday night, and then we will go over it Wednesday night. And if we finish it early enough, maybe then I would go over some of the history and get it in that way, so it won't be lost that way. Okay. Are there any questions anybody has?
Yes, I have a question. Just
Sure.
Because Pesach starts now on Saturday evening. Do we make Havdalah after?
Like I said, at the Kiddush, if you remember, I pointed out that when we recite the Kiddush on Saturday night, we add those certain passages. Every Haggadah will tell that to you. It will have it in the Haggadah. On Saturday night, you add these passages.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else? Okay. Study hard. See everybody next week. Have a good week.
Good night,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Bye.
Bye. Good night.
Bye.